So I spent quite a bit of time talking about the idea of double meaning and misunderstanding that goes through John, and I think that's one of the biggest ones. I also spent a fair amount of time talking about the prologue. What I want to do now, since I don't have the time or the ability to give you a full commentary on John, wouldn't be the point of this, I want to just highlight some of the things that happen as you walk through the rest of the text. And this is going to have to be truly a highlights reel because we have limited time and space to do everything that we would want. The big thing that I like to say about the Gospel of John, when you read it from, say, chapter 1, verse 19 on, is that, as we've noted, very, very few of the stories overlap between John and the synoptics. And I guess, and as I said before, the best way to understand that, I think, is that John is aware of the synoptic tradition, something like Mark, maybe even Matthew and Luke as well, and he's not trying to replace them, but he's actually feeling the freedom to say some different things because of the knowledge that the churches would have had widespreadly of these stories, these Jesus traditions that we know well from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so what that enables us to do as readers as well, especially for this class, the best thing to do is just to read John and go through each passage, and I've preached a lot of these passages, many of you have as well, but rather than landing very deeply in any of these, let me just do a kind of quick skimming across this and highlight some key differences. First thing in chapter 2, of course, to notice is that the cleansing of the temple happens here at the beginning of John's ministry, Jesus' ministry, rather than at the end with the synoptics. Now, again, we can wrestle with that historically, and the traditional Augustinian view was to argue, and this is what many evangelicals would hold to as well, that there are actually two temple cleansings, one that John records at the beginning and one that the synoptics record at the end. And I think that's a very fine solution. I think on the issues of historiography that we've talked about, it's not necessary to read it that way, but I think I can understand that. I do understand that as a very common Christian understanding. What I think is the most important thing to highlight is to ask instead the literary question, which is to say, why does John put the temple cleansing at the beginning? And I think it's part of his bigger point of Jesus as the replacement of all that God has been doing. Not just the fulfillment, it is that, but Jesus as the true image of which everything else is a shadow. And so I think for Jesus to show up right at the beginning and to talk about his body as the temple is a very strong statement that helps us learn to reread the Old Testament in light of Jesus, and helps us read John correctly as well. You may recall what I read when I talked about the theme of double meaning and misunderstanding, that it says, after the resurrection, then they understood what he meant. That is, as one scholar, Richard Hayes, has said, is like whispering to us, here's how to read everything you're about to read in John. That is, when you read these stories I'm about to give you, you should think of them both as the replacement of the Old Testament's realities and also as having more than meets the eye when you first see them. And so that's what happens in the temple cleansing. Jesus comes in and sets the tone here for John of Jesus at the center of where God meets with humanity. He changes everything and says that he is actually the temple. That's the opening point. Then you get into the story with Nicodemus in chapter 3 that we've already looked at. It leads to the very famous words of John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. There you go with this main Johannine idea that is being taught all throughout, the idea of eternal life given through the Son, sent by the Father. And then the story goes on, and just to skip across several, the woman at the well in Samaria, so many rich things in this. First, notice that this is John's way of doing what Matthew did, of the redefining of the people of God. Matthew did it with fulfillment quotations and Isaianic quotes and redefining Gentile and Jew. John does it in his own very powerful, subtle, or not so subtle, narrative way of having Jesus relate to a Samaritan woman and having her understand when the disciples and the other Jews don't understand, and then explicitly stating it with this and making it a matter of worship, where Jesus says to her, after all this conversation, that a time is coming when God will the Father seeks those who worship in spirit and in truth, and it won't just be in Jerusalem. That's John's very powerful way of saying the very same thing that we saw in the synoptic tradition, that the gospel of God through Jesus Christ is for all people. It's said in a different way, and saying it a different way has different power and implications, but the idea is still basically the same, that Jesus is showing that he is come to fulfill the Abrahamic covenant, to use more Galatians and synoptic terms, but he is coming to seek those, all of those, Samaritans and not, who will worship in spirit and in truth. It's a very powerful way of saying the same thing, and the Samaritans, of course, respond. You have other stories that are similar. Quite a few healing stories happen in chapters 4 and 5 and following, and this leads into strong Christological statements about Jesus as equal with the Father in chapter 5, his authority being shown, and that leads us up into then chapter 6. Another place, or one of the places, that actually does overlap explicitly with the synoptic tradition, and that is, of course, the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on water. It's a good thing to ask, it's a good question to ask, why is this one of the few stories that overlaps? Well, I'd suggest to you that it overlaps because this is one of the rare 4 gospel stories, because this is so crucial to the New Testament's understanding of its own fulfillment of God's work in the world through Jesus, particularly the theme again of the Exodus. Because here we have the same Exodus being evoked with the miraculous feeding in the wilderness and then the water crossing that's miraculous as well, resulting in, of course, an I am statement. And all of that is crucial, I think, for all 4 of the evangelists, because that's at the core of Jesus' self-understanding and the church's understanding that what Jesus is about is bringing about a new Exodus. So that's the continuity between John and the synoptics. The difference is this. If you look ahead to John, you'll see that, and we'll see this when we get there, that in the last night of his life, in the Passover meal that they celebrate together, what's noticeably absent is indeed the Last Supper. In other words, they are having a supper together, we know, at the Passover, but instead of the words of institution that we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that become the basis for the Lord's Supper that the church continues to celebrate and 1 Corinthians 11 refers to, that's completely absent in John's last night John's description of Jesus' last night with his disciples. Where it is here in John 6. And when we get to that part of John, I'll explain what he puts in its place in John 13. But here in John 6, it's important to point out that this same theology of the Eucharist, or the same theology of Jesus' miraculous wilderness feeding and water crossing, as being more than just a miracle, but actually being a theological teaching, that theology is already built into John 6 in a way that's much more explicit than it is in the synoptic tradition. You may recall that I pointed out that once you get to the Last Supper in the synoptic tradition, that the very same verbs and expressions are used, that Jesus took bread and blessed it, looked up, blessed it, broke it, gave it to his disciples. That's intentionally the same words that are there in the Last Supper and in the wilderness feeding. Well, John just conflates it all together and gives us that theology of both right here in John chapter 6. And that's why it's much fuller. And if you think I'm making this up, all you have to do is read what Jesus says, that even as Moses provided manna in the wilderness, so too I'm giving you my own flesh and blood to eat and drink, which is of course offensive to them, but it's exactly the same theology of the Last Supper that becomes the Lord's Supper for us. So it's a very powerful way of telling the story. I suppose I should say something also about the famous story in John chapter 8 of the woman caught in adultery, and particularly John 7:53 to 8:11 is what we're talking about. This story is similar in its problems to what we saw at the end of Mark 16, except for it's in some ways easier, in some ways more complicated. You may recall that the ending of Mark is disputed because the manuscript witnesses reveal many different ways of reading it. Some have that longer ending and some don't, and actually there's several different versions of the longer ending. This is also a textual variant issue or a manuscript issue in John 7:53 to 8:11, but the data is a little bit different in this way. First of all, this story does exist together as a story, but in different manuscripts it exists in different places. Sometimes here, sometimes in other places in John, sometimes not at all in John. And the other thing we can see is that this story seems to be very ancient and actually connected with Jesus very early on. And so we have this kind of mixed data. It seems to be a very old story that seems to fit with the general tone of John, yet at the same time it's in these different places in manuscripts, which says that it maybe was a floating story that wasn't entirely, and maybe wasn't there originally and wasn't entirely clear where it fits. And so you have a real dilemma, because it seems to be a very old story, yet there doesn't seem to be entire manuscript support in the earliest manuscripts for it. So when it comes to teaching or preaching this, there are different opinions among evangelicals and others about what to do. I think because the story has a great antiquity to it, and because it seems to be true in many ways to what John is doing, I don't think there's great harm to be done in teaching or preaching it. At the same time, I can recognize that some people might feel more comfortable skipping over it because it doesn't seem to be witnessed to here, and again, maybe probably wasn't original to John. It's really hard to say. It's a difficult dilemma. What makes it really tricky is that if you're preaching through Mark, you could just kind of end, and they'll never know. You could just end at 16, 8, or 9 and be done with it. When you're preaching through John, I guess you could give this to the associate pastor or something that day, and you can take a vacation. Might be the easiest solution, but it's a little harder to skip. And so when you deal with a passage like this and an issue like this, I would not try to deal with it in the pulpit because I think it's too confusing and too complicated, but you could maybe deal with it on a Sunday night or an adult Sunday school and kind of approach it that way and just pick up the preaching of the text the next week in 8:12. That might be the best solution.